All right, are we going?
All right. Welcome, you guys, and thanks for joining us. This discussion promises to be
I can't hear anything.
Yeah, I think he might be cut off or mute. It says waiting for Converse. He's out.
All right.
all right. Sorry about that. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've been having some technical difficulties. All right. Welcome and thank you guys for joining us tonight as this discussion promises to be meaningful, both by being an important topic as well as having substantive contenders. I want to start with a few announcements. Praise and I will be moderating a debate tomorrow evening on Modern Day Debates channel. Secondly, while I have many projects over the next couple of weeks coming up that are still yet to be confirmed, Skylar Fiction and I will be having a discussion on his channel next Wednesday. So you can check out his channel for that, or just subscribe and hit the notification to receive the alerts for these discussions. And also, if you want to ask a question, make sure you put @ConverseContender in the comments in the live chat so that I'll be able to see it. And please share this if you're able. All right, so a 10-minute
Cutting out.
a 10-minute opening for each side, a 10-minute rebuttal, 35-minute open discussion from there, and then we'll take questions. We're going to start with Caleb, dry apologist.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. So, my position on the issue of the Bible and slavery is that it does seem that there are problematic passages within Scripture, at least on the natural surface level reading. I don't think that these passages represent what God actually commanded. I don't think they represent God's will or his moral nature. I think that they're not necessarily as bad as they're oftentimes represented, and I'm open to having my mind changed about these passages, but they don't seem to represent what a morally perfect being would command. I think they more plausibly represent what the people of the time thought was moral. And then over the course of the Bible, we see a moral progression, and there's never a clear denunciation of slavery, but there are some passages that seem to hint at that. And ultimately, I think that God inspired the Bible to progressively reveal his moral nature, but we don't find his perfect nature fully revealed in all passages. But I'm open to having my mind changed on that. It just seems to be that that best explains the passages. So I'm just going to read a few, and I'm interested to hear Praise's interpretation of these. So, of course, in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 43, it's God's talking about the Israelite slaves, and he says, "You shall not rule over them with harshness, but shall fear your God. As for the male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from among the aliens residing with you, and from their families that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness." So the implication seems to be that people who are not the Israelites can be treated as slaves, and perhaps more harshly than the Israelites are, and passed down to the next generation. And that might have been the way things were at the time, but it does seem to be a morally, or at least not morally ideal scenario. It seems to be morally problematic to treat some people as less equal than others. Then in Exodus chapter 21, we have some passages regarding disciplining slaves. Okay, so chapter 21, verse 20, it says, Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Now, I know there are different ways to interpret this passage, but it seems to be the plain-faced reading is that the slave master is only to be punished if the slave dies, but if the slave recovers, then there isn't a punishment because the slave is the property of the slave master. So again, that seems to be a morally problematic scenario. And then this is more indirectly related to slavery, but in Numbers 31, so they kill all of the, I'm going to find the passage, it's in Numbers 31, kill all of the women that have slept with men and all of the young boys, but they're allowed to keep the girls or women who have not slept with men for themselves, and that would be presumably as slaves or some sort of servitude. But again, this seems to be a morally problematic passage. And to me, it just reinforces the notion that within the Old Testament, we find some morally problematic passages. It's not to say these passages are not inspired, but I don't think that they fully reflect God's nature. I think that God progressively reveals his nature over the courses of the pages of Scripture. So those are the three passages I really want to focus on: Numbers 31, Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 46, and then Exodus chapter 21, verse 20. So I'm going to yield the rest of my time and hear from Praise.
All right, Caleb, thank you so much for that opening. Now, Caleb, Praise, let's get your 10-minute opening. And we'll take the rest of that time that Caleb didn't use toward the end.
Perfect. So I appreciate I appreciate Tri-Apologist for participating in this debate, and also Converse for setting it up. To begin with, provocative and taboo subjects like slavery, I feel need to be defined or explained. That's why I decided to cite a reputable source on this issue. Quote, scholars do not agree on a definition of slavery. This term has been used at various times for a wide range of institutions, including plantation slavery, forced slavery, the drudgery of factories and sweatshops, child labor, semi-voluntary prostitution, bride price marriage, child adoption for payment, and paid for surrogate motherhood, end quote. Citation, Encyclopedia Cultural Anthropology, David Levinson and Melvin Ember. Now I want to switch the focus on the ancient Near East socioeconomic system and unpack that a bit. Coincidentally, there are few better to do that than the ultra-familiar ancient Near East scholar Raymond Westbrook. Quote, freedom in the ancient Near East was a relative, not an absolute state, as the ambiguity of the term slave in the region's languages illustrates. Slave could use to be referred to as subordinate in the social ladder. Thus, the subjects of a king were called his slaves, even though they were free citizens. The king himself, if a vassal, was the slave of his emperor. Kings, emperors, the commoners alike were slaves of the gods. Even a social inferior, when addressing a social superior, referred to himself out of politeness as your slave, or aved in the Hebrew. There were, moreover, a plethora of servile conditions that were not regarded as slavery, such as a son, daughter, wife, serf, or human pledge. Citation, Ancient Near East Law, 2 volumes, Raymond Westbrook, Brill, 2003. While a slavery was present in the ancient Near East, it was not the only form of servitude, and it was not the dominant form of servitude. Quote, in brief, most varieties of slavery did not exhibit the 3 elements that were dominant in the New World: slaves as property and commodities, their use exclusively as labor, and their lack of freedom. End quote. Citation, Harry Holt, Encyclopedia of Culture and Anthropology, David Levinson, Melvin Ember, Volume 4, page 1190. This citation from ancient Near East scholar Rene Lopez demonstrates the mutual diplomacy between Israel, the suzerain, and vassal nations. Quote, There existed two types of covenants in Israel, as well as in the ancient Near East. The promissory covenants bound the suzerain master to the vassal servant unconditionally. The obligatory covenants, also known as the suzerainty treaties, bound the vassal servant to be faithful, obedient to the suzerain master. And end quote. Citation: Rene Lopez, Israeli Covenants in the Light of the Ancient Near East Covenants, Schaeffer Theological Seminary, Volume 10. Rob Barrett, in his book, Disloyalty and Destruction, Religion and Politics in Deuteronomy and the Modern World, on page 38, explained the construction of the Suzerain Treaty was based upon loyalty and love. Quote, both the ancient Near East treaties and Deuteronomy stipulate the undivided allegiance of the vassal Israel to the suzerain YHWH, Yahweh. Key terminology in Deuteronomy for loyalty also appears in treaties. At the center is love. So these treaties, the Suzerain Treaty, was constructed upon love. And additionally, ancienthebrew.org, run by well-known Hebrew scholars such as Jeff Bennett, point out Adam in Genesis 1, 26 through 28 is the first example of the suzerain/vassal covenant. Clearly, there is no hint of involuntary slavery here. It's just a working relationship with the suzerain, who is Yahweh. That basically sums up the ancient Near East outside the tyrannical states such as Egypt. Everything was based on contractual labor. Citation: Suzerain/Vassal Covenants by Brian Keith Hudsum. All these supposed instances of forced labor, mas in the Hebrew, are explained by the Suzerain Treaty, which was a contract that Israel Israel, the sovereign state, agreed upon with the vassal states or nations surrounding Israel and weaker and smaller states. These vassal kings agreed upon conditions and services they would provide to the suzerain, which included physical labor for construction works, maintaining diplomatic loyalty to the suzerain, providing military support when the suzerain went to war, and supplying tribute to the suzerain in the form of materials and products such as gold, livestock, manufactured goods. 2 Samuel 20:24, 1 Kings 4:6, 1 Kings 5:13 through 14, 9:15 and 21, 1 Kings 12:18, 2 Chronicles 10:18. The Hebrews are recorded in participating with a number of cities and states in vassalage. Joshua 9:3 through 27. 16:10, Joshua 17:13, Judges 1:28, 30 through 35, and are also recorded as having fulfilled their obligations to the Suzerainty Treaty by protecting their vassals from military attack and hostile forces. God punished the Hebrew nation for their breach of the Suzerain Treaty, 2 Samuel 21:1, and the king of Israel is required to compensate the Gibeonites for their loss, 2 Samuel 21:2 through 9. This demonstrates that the Hebrew Suzerainty Treaty placed a higher order of obligation on the suzerain, in this case Israel, than it did on the vassal in the case of the Gibeonites, a situation unique in the ancient Near East. Here's another thing. Archaeology confirms the Suzerainty Treaty. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, Volume 1, page 96, mentions excavations have revealed a wide variety of treaties involving trade and commerce Israel made with ancient Near East cultures. A glaring example of the Suzerainty Treaty was Pharaoh. In letters from governors of vassal states subject to Egypt, the local rulers identify themselves as slaves of Pharaoh, even though they were not his personal property or are treated like slaves. So the Ved in the Hebrews, so these would be servants. See, we got to get this out of the way when we use local modern terminology. We equivocate that with the culture back then. That's a huge problem. And even though they lived 100 kilometers outside of Egypt and ruled local states and provinces, quote, to Pharaoh, ruler of the heavens and earth, from Laberu, governor of Shechem, I am your slave who is less than the dust under your feet and renew my covenant with you. As my Pharaoh, by bowing before you 7 times, even 7 times, I am always been loyal to Pharaoh. I neither a traitor nor a rebel. I pay tribute on time, and I obey every order which the representative of Pharaoh here in Canaan gives me. Citation. This is Victor Harold Matthews. He's a very prominent ancient Near East scholar. Don J. Benjamin, Old Testament Parallels, Law and Stories of the Ancient Near East. So Egyptian slavery, note in regards to Egyptian forced slavery, Moss. So here's another thing that I like to point out, though, that Moss is different than servitude that was in the ancient Near East with slaves. So I think I'm going to end that. With that, I end my time.
All right. Thank you so much, Praise, for that. Caleb, you have 10 minutes for rebuttal.
Okay, so yeah, thanks for that praise. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information, and I mean, personally, I think some of these passages, like the ones I've cited, are kind of vague, and they're, or at least vague enough that there's room for interpretation and such. But I still want to press on these verses that I'm willing to concede that perhaps that it was an indentured servitude. But if we look at Leviticus chapter 25, even if we say male and female servants, there's still this idea that there's a distinction between the Israelites and the non-Israelites, and that the non-Israelites can be passed down to others. To me, the implication seems to be that there's less freedom for those who are not Israelites, and to me that seems morally problematic. Now, again, I know there are different ways to explain the context for that, but I'm curious how Praise explains that. And if you already covered that, then I apologize. I was trying to keep track, but there was a lot that was said. And then in Numbers chapter 31, we have this image of the Israelites take other people in warfare, and as presumably they become slaves, or at least that's a common interpretation. And again, that does seem morally problematic, to conquer other people and then take those other people as slaves. And the implication seems to be in Numbers 31 that the women are not killed because they're innocent, but then they are taken as slaves. And then there's the morally problematic aspect of why the other people are killed, and there doesn't seem to be mercy that's shown. And I know our main focus is on slavery, but I'm drawn upon that passage as well, because to me it highlights the morally problematic content of some of these passages, or at least the apparent morally problematic content. And then again in Exodus chapter 21, we get this idea, or this implication, that if the slave or servant doesn't die from the beating, then there's no punishment for the master, because the slave or servant is the property of the master. And I know it can be debated what that word property, how that should be translated, what that means. But to me, in all of these passages, there seems to be this implication that if somebody's not an Israelite, they can be treated differently than if they are. And I know that, the Hebrew people are God's chosen people, but it still seems morally problematic that other people would be treated without mercy. It doesn't seem to be the ethic that Jesus preached. And I would argue it's not because God gave lesser commands, like some Christians will argue, but I'd argue that a morally perfect being can't give morally problematic commands, and a lesser command at some level does become morally problematic. Certainly, some lesser commands can be concessions, but these seem to go beyond acceptable, or at least what would seem to be a morally acceptable concession. And again, my argument is not that I'm judging God. I don't think God commanded these things. So that's my perspective. So I really want to hear, Praise, how you interpret each of these passages, and I'll concede my time.
All right. Thanks so much, Caleb, for that. Praise, you got 10 minutes for rebuttal.
Yeah, I plan to go in depth on these and explain these, because I think there's some misconceptions and lack of understanding here that I've noticed it. But it's not really the fault of the Christians out there, because they're not. I think it's hard to access this information. So I'm going to go through this, and maybe I think it's going to hopefully open the eyes of people But the beginning of my presentation, what I was showing though is the whole ancient Near East was under the suzerain treaty, vassal treaty. So a treaty is a contract that they agree upon. So that, I think, that does address Leviticus 25:46 with you may buy. And there's another thing there. If you want to look in the grammar there, you may buy. I think it's kana in the Hebrew, and it's there. It's in the what they call the podosis. It's in the subjunctive tense. And it means in the mood of possibility. So it doesn't even mean like they were stealing people or any of that stuff, or stealing from the nations, the goyim. So I think that is very important to make that distinction, that everyone was under contracts. So Israel could buy from the nations under their treaties. But see, the problem, I think, runs into the word forever, or like it continues on. It's what they call perpetuity. But you have to understand Hebrew language as well, or how the covenant is, how is organized. Well, for instance, the word olam by rabbi scholars could just mean to the 50th year, which is, hold on, I'm going to give you citations and stuff to back this up. One second. So I'll just give you some citations. The Hebrews were permitted to pass servants of the nations as inheritance to the next generations until their debts were repaid, which is the meaning of olam in Leviticus 25:46, translated perpetuity. Jewish rabbi Hamik Davar, in his commentary Leviticus 25:44, points out, when the Israelites purchased foreigners, it was meant to transform, not enslave. Quote, a mitzvah, meaning good deed. So it's a good deed to purchase them and take them out of idolatry. So these are business transactions. There's nothing that's sinister going on. There's nothing that's being imposed upon anyone. And notice it says buy. I'm going to get into that in a second too. The Hebrews were permitted to pass servants of the nations as inheritance to the next generations until their debts were repaid, which is the meaning of olam. And I went through that perpetuity. The text does not mean they were permanent possessions, but is an explanation as to why they did not go out on the 7th year of release or the Jubilee. That's what I'm talking about, the Jubilee. Most Jewish scholars believe that it was the Jubilee. So whenever the master died or the 50th year, they would be released. So it's not perpetuity as in like generation after generational slavery or institutionalized slavery. But like I said, this was based upon debt servitude anyway. This is not imposed slavery. Evidence for this comes from the earliest Jewish commentaries. I can go through Mechilta, Rabbi Ishmael, and Misfatum, Kedushin. The Targum, I'll give you an example. The Targum Jonathan, Exodus 21:6. Note that Targum Jonathan is one of the earliest extant commentaries on this passage. This same understanding was applied to the servant who voluntarily chose to serve his master past the date of emancipation. The subsequent Jewish tradition, the statement that he shall be with you, a slave forever, was interpreted to mean the rest of the master's life or until a Jubilee year. But here's another thing that's really interesting. Well, that citation is from Dwayne L. Christensen, volume 6A. But here's another thing too. If you read Exodus 21, and I think it's between 3 and 5, it says that a person can leave out and come in. But interesting, in the manuscripts, the word is avri. An avri, and I'll give you the citation here in a second, is a foreigner of a nation. So if you see the correlation there, being perpetuity, and those two passages reflect each other. That means they can serve the master for life and get their ear pierced. These are not Israelites in Exodus 21:3, because the Vri are not Israelites. And your citation is hold on one second, because It is J. Sklar in Leviticus commentary and Deuteronomy commentary. But so I mean, I think that explains Leviticus 25:46 is that this was a these are business transactions among the suzerain and vassal treaties. Now, for Exodus 21, you need to understand what's happening here. And I'm going to go through that here in 1 second. Just get my citation up. Yeah, so if you go to verses 26 through 27, there's an apparent loophole. It says if a master inflicts a person's face or any type of other feature of someone's body, that they are released out of their contract. That is very important because that gives the servant or the one serving the master a loophole to get out of their contract. That's why in Exodus 21:21 it says that it takes 2 to 3 days to deliberate. And I'm gonna give you citation of that too. Yeah, so we need to distinguish that needs to be made. That point needs to be made that there is a loophole in verses 26 through 27. And the reason why it took 3 days to deliberate is because it protects the master from being frauded. I'm going to give you a citation. The laws of Exodus 20 through 21 were instituted to protect the employer from being frauded by their aved through an apparent loophole, because it mandates an aved would be released if any unwarranted assault was committed. 2 or 3 witnesses were needed to convict the master of any abuse. This is Walter Kaiser, Old Testament Ethics, page 102. Jewish rabbi scholar Rabbi Chisuni makes the point 24 hours was sufficient to determine if this was self-defense, not a day or two. So this was up in the air. This was not mandated. I mean, this was not legislative. And that's another thing, too, that the laws what people perceive as laws in the Mosaic Covenant were actually not legislative. And there's so much commentary on that from Christopher Wright and so on. But here's what Christopher Wright says. Old Testament specialist Christopher Wright, the inclusion of the tooth indicates that the law does not intend only grievous bodily harm, but any unwarranted assault. And this is citation, God's people and God's land and the property in the Old Testament. The divine edict for an employer to receive the death penalty in the case of a homicide of their aved shows not only equal value as free citizens, but here's another thing I want people, if they can get, this is so vital for Christians to get a hold of resources like a lexicon, interlinears, because they explain, it gives this background information and grammar that people need to be, they need to be up with and understand. Note the infinitive absolute grammar construct signifies an emphatic command for the death penalty as reciprocated in Exodus 21:12 and Exodus 21:20. And this is from Leonard Kaplan, Ruddy Kosher, The Weimar Movement, Liberalism, Political Theology, page 382. And this is also in the Targum Jonathan. And here's another valid point that needs to be made. Numbers 35 highlights hypothetical objects of murder, such as the instrument of iron, verse 16, a stone, verse 17, a hand, verse 8, in verse 18. So a rod used in Exodus 21:20 is just as much of a hypothetical object as the others, thus eliminating the myth of the rod being used as common practice for beating slaves. So if you're going to say that the rod indicates some type of common practice, well, you're going to need to demonstrate that textually, because in Numbers 35, it shows that they have hypothetical objects there too. So I think it's pretty clear that this law, and especially Christopher Wright, validated this too, that this law is to protect the master from being frauded. And like I said, there's a loophole in verses 26 through 27. As far as Numbers 31, there's nothing mentioning about slavery there. In fact, if you read the rules of war in Deuteronomy 20, and I'm going to go through that here too and give you some citation. Do you know how long do I have, Converse?
Caleb actually conceded a little bit of his time. If he's fine with it, you can have a couple more
Yeah,
minutes.
that's fine.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give some background information on also Numbers 31. So the reason why that in Numbers 31, the female virgins and the young children, infants were spared because they weren't infected by these plagues. And I'm going to give some citation for that too. But I'm going to get back to the woman slavery thing though. In fact, there's these laws in Deuteronomy 20 that prohibit any type of sexual slavery, and these are rules of war, of prisoners of war. So, for instance, so in Deuteronomy 21, the Hebrew word anah, so that's what they are. Is they would be anahs. And excuse me 1 second here. I'm trying to get through these notes as fast as I can. Prisoner. I think it's Deuteronomy 20, yeah. But so I think, as far as Exodus and Leviticus, I think we explained that. I mean, maybe I'll talk to Caleb about this and see what he feels upon that. But and the prisoners, the rules for the prisoners of war, it says to pare their nails, and it says to for a month you're supposed to take care of them. And those are the rules for any woman or female POW. And there's nothing there in the text that says there's rape or anything there. In fact, marriage is indicated there because if you go to, like I said, this is why Christians need to be familiar with this, the apologist. And it says if you like a woman or a POW, then you can take her in marriage. And that's what it means with the subjunctive tense or subjunctive mood. And it means like it's possibility or the mood of hope. So we know there's no forced sex or forced marriage there. And God expects people to get married. Exodus 22:16. Virgins are supposed to get married. I think that's pretty clear in the Torah. And like I said before, the reason why the female virgins and the young children and infants were spared is because they weren't infected by plagues that were destroying Israel and pervading through Israel at that time. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. If we can go to more detail, if you want, Caleb, in our open discussion, but right there, I'll end it right there.
All right, praise. Thank you so much for that rebuttal. We're going to go into 35-minute open discussion now. I just wanted to let everyone know that we agreed ahead of time that we wouldn't be strict on the time because there are certain times when Caleb or praise will be short and times when they're going to need to take a little bit longer. We just want to make sure that all the points are made. So we're going to head into that 35-minute open discussion. And you guys just, Caleb, if you want to start us off.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for that information, Praise. So I know you mentioned that in the context of Leviticus chapter 25, that the slaves or servants taken from the nations were taken to pay off the debt. It sounded like you were arguing. And I know that you had mentioned some Targums and later writings, but is there a passage in Leviticus, or excuse me, or another verse in the Bible that argues that the foreign slaves or servants are only indentured until they pay off their debt? I know you mentioned the Jubilee year, but my understanding is that that applied to Hebrew slaves.
Yeah, so the word olam, it means the word forever, or how they commonly interpret that, or perpetuity, by Hebrew scholars would mean to the 50th year, or when the master dies. That's the typical belief upon perpetuity, forever, olam. But as far as the debts, this is, in the opening, I mentioned how Israel was in contract with other nations and other vassal nations. So we know these are contractual obligations. So they would be contractually. There was a bunch. You see how they were working together there contractually, or a business agreement. So these were agreements, and they could buy from the nations because they were already in contract with them under treaties.
So could the foreign slaves or servants, could they leave? Or, I mean, it says they're passed down. I mean, okay. And what verse would you use to support that?
Obviously, it would be Deuteronomy 23. It says, if in fact, I'll go there real quick. And here's another, I'm going to make this other point I forgot to after this as well. It's Deuteronomy 23:15, Deuteronomy 23:16. And I'll read that real quick. It's 15, okay. So he shall not deliver unto his master the servant Aved, which has escaped from his master, which would be an Adon. He shall dwell with thee he shall even dwell among you in that place, which he shall choose in one of thy gates where he liketh best, and thou shalt not oppress him. So he could leave and go into another business venture. Like he can go to another type of master to work and go under his contract and go on. Yeah, he would drop. I mean, today we use drop a contract or whatever. He can go under another contract. Yes, I think Deuteronomy 23:15 makes that clear. In 16, but also here's the point I forgot to mention to you, Caleb. Did you know in Ezekiel 44:28 that the Lord is called property, achuzah, the same verbiage as Leviticus 25:46, and he shall be inherited and down to the generation. So if you're going to apply, if you think there's anything foul there, then we're going to have to say, well, in Ezekiel 44:28, that God is going to be the property or slave of Israel. So I think that assumption falls flat in its face.
All right. All right. Yeah, that's interesting. Now in verse 46, when it says, "But as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness." It says, "These you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness." I mean, the implication seems to be that the non-Hebrew servants or slaves can be treated more harshly. I mean, would you concede that, or is there or how would you interpret that?
Yeah, I think that to me that could be an argument from silence, or I just don't see how. Like, to me, that the logic behind that, just because it says for Israel you can treat them with no rigor, then therefore you can just treat others harshly. In fact, I think that's debunked in Leviticus 19:34, where it says to love thy foreigner as yourself. So it looks like, if anything, they had more problems. To me, it might be the opposite. Maybe Israel had more problems within themselves, having to respect each other and stuff. I think there was more in-house problems than from having foreigners come in and being proselytized.
Okay. And then now turn into Exodus 21. So Yeah, I mean, I know that it's often argued that, okay, so in 20 verses 20 and 21, if the slave doesn't die, there's no punishment. And then we jump to 26 and 27, where it's when the slave owner strikes the eye of, an eye of a male or female slave, and then the tooth, then they're set free. And then that's and it seems like you're arguing as well that that's like a caveat, more of like a generic, like if they suffer any damage, then they're set free. Is that right?
And I even have Christopher Wright actually says that ancient East scholar. That's just trope for meaning any type of injury. So you just can't mistreat any of your servants. And if you can, do you see the loophole there? If easily the servant can make a thing about the master and say, "Oh, look, I got hit," and then he'd be out of his contract. And that's why that's why the courts need to be involved, and that's why it took 2 to 3 days to deliberate if there was a false accusation.
But why would the slave owner be hitting the slave at all?
Yeah, that is a assumption. That is, there's nothing in the text that would ever indicate that. Like I said, the golden rule itself, which to me is not just your typical golden rule, because the love your neighbor or love foreigners as yourself is like to pamper yourself, to spoil yourself. I mean, that's what people normally do. So you have to go above and beyond than just the law of reciprocity. To me, that's like basically what Jesus commanded in the New Testament, to love your enemies. If they smite you in the cheek, turn your cheek. I think that's the type of love. And I think the Hebrew, makes that clear. Ahab in the Hebrew means to be like inner love that's intergenerated. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's possible. Now, in verse 21, though, where it says, "But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property." I mean, how do you interpret this clause, "for the slave is the owner's property"? I mean, I guess I can see where somebody would read that and say, "Oh, well, the slave is the property, so he could punish them as long as it's not severe." So how would you interpret that?
Yeah, it's actually not property in the Hebrew. It's kisef, and it means money. The servant is the master's money. So we that already debunks the idea that this was servants were treated as chattel. No, this was a business covenant. It's all financial based. So we can't, it's so easy to equivocate and conflate those two, but there is a distinction there between financial and chattel.
Well, why do you think it says that? Like, why couldn't the verse stop with, "But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment"? Like, I mean, I don't know. I'm just wondering, why do you think it tacks on "for the slave is the owner's money or property"?
Well, that's typical. Like I was explaining in my, I think it was my opening or maybe, but I explained that is typical language. No, it's not my opening; it's my rebuttal. But it was typical language of for the judges to deliberate upon. But if there was any, if it was a false accusation. So that's why it took 2 to 3, 1 to 3, I even cited it could be 1 day. So it was up in the air between how long it could take to make sure that the time frame there, I mean, whatever time frame they needed, just to make sure it wasn't a false accusation.
I mean, one interpretation that I've heard, or maybe occurred to me, but I think I've heard this, is the idea that "for the slave is the owner's property" gives an implication that the owner would presumably not be punishing the slave. So it's like there's this presumption of innocence, or maybe that's what you're arguing. Is that the argument, or is it a little bit different?
It's judicial language. This involved the legal process. In Deuteronomy 20, let me give you Deuteronomy 25. It goes into this process, and in fact, I'm going to read it to you real quick. And I'll even give you a citation of that in 1 second. But I'm going to read these passages for you. And it shall be, if a wicked man be worthy to be beaten, that the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten before the face according to his fault by a certain number, 40 stripes, that he may give him not exceed less. If he exceed and beat him above any of these stripes, then thy brother shall seem vile unto thee. So you can see that for someone to get beaten, there has to be, through the rod. So this actually proves kind of corporal punishment. But if someone, let's say, raped someone, something like that, then they would have to go through the judicial process. And then if they were found guilty, they'd be beaten, or even the death penalty. So that's why the same type of language reflects this, that before a man can be beaten, they would have to go through this judicial process. And I'm going to give you a citation real quick. So this is from Walter. Make sure I'm going to get all this in here. Quote, according to the Aved servant, according to the plain meaning of the text, and consonant with the practice of the Torah, we can simply translate this as he does not even have to survive 2 days for the master to be accused of murder. Even a survival of 24 hours is sufficient. We find a parallel construction in Deuteronomy 17:6 on the basis of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses. That's why it took a few days for that to happen. This is corroborated in Walter Kaiser's book, Towards the Old Testament Ethics, Grand Rapids, Zondervan, because it conveys that since the Aved servants could appeal to the court of judges to deliberate the removal of their debt burden in the case of an abusive master, like I said in verses 26 through 27, the master would be presumed innocent rather than guilty in verse 21 until further evidence is demonstrated. These laws mentioned in 21 through 21 are not given to facilitate slavery, but rather to deliberate unwarranted assault. So I think hopefully that would clear up what maybe you were asking there.
Okay. So you're arguing that the passage is about, like, if the master were to attack the slave, is that right?
Yeah, let's say like the master got mad at a slave because he didn't. Not a slave. You got to be careful with these the usage of these words you use. So I think Aved's the best word to use, or servant. Let's say the master he got mad at his Aved for not plucking out cherries good enough, and he slapped him, and it caused him to get bruises and stuff. That was against the Torah. That was a condemnable offense. And if he told the judges this, or anyone in the community, they could punish the master for that. Especially if it was a death, he would have the death penalty.
Now, there was one point in Exodus chapter 21, I can't remember exactly what you said, but I think you said at the beginning that it applied to non-Hebrew slaves as well. Is that right?
Yes, and I'm going to give you that citation. In Exodus, here's the site. I'm glad you brought this up because I gave the wrong source here. So, quote, the buying of a Hebrew servant in Exodus 21:2 would most likely refer to a foreign Habiru servant in Leviticus 25:44 through 46. But here is what I mentioned it wrong, but here's the correct citation for this. It's Tyndale Old Testament Commentaries, Deuteronomy, and it's Edward J. Woods, and it's page 335. So, these were most likely in Exodus 21:2 foreigners, which corresponds with Leviticus 25:44 through 46.
All right. Now, in chapter, maybe this was addressed here, but in chapter 21, verse 2, when it says, when you buy a male, and I'm just reading the NRSV, so it could be mistranslated, but when you buy a male Hebrew slave, and it doesn't, at what point does it clarify that this also applies to the non-Hebrew servants?
It's not Deuteronomy 21, it's Exodus 21:2. Right. Yeah. And it's Habiru, and it's in the manuscripts. and it's very hard to be indicative to show that it's indicative of Israelites. It's really indicative of foreigners outside of Israel, and it's the same trope again that they shall be kept for olam. Well, in verse 5, I believe I'm going to give you real quick. 21:5. It says if they want to pierce their ear, they can serve the master for olam. It's the same type of language there. To me, they link and they reflect each other. They go hand in hand. I think that they are linked together.
Wait, sorry. This passage and what passage are linked?
So this would be Exodus 21:5 through 6. So Exodus 21:5 through 6 and Leviticus 25:44 through 46.
And what is the, sorry, I just want to make sure I'm following. What is the specific argument for why they're linked?
In verse 2, where it says, if he came in by himself, so we know that this is voluntary. The word there is avri. And it's not Israelite. It's in fact the word for Israelite is completely different. It's crossed. I'm going to give you. In fact, I'll give you the word real quick in the Hebrew. They're two completely different words. It would be a Yisraelite. So be a Yisraelite would be the proper term. It's not an Avri. Avris are Habirus. And that's why that guy mentioned that. And that's why they're connected. That's why they're correlated in Exodus 21:5 through 6, or even to say 2 through 6, and then Leviticus 25:44 through 6.
But what is the word? I mean, is it where it says, I mean, in my translation says male Hebrew slave. Is that the word that you're arguing is perhaps mistranslated, or?
Yeah, it says, starting in verse 2, Hebrew servant. Okay, if you buy a Hebrew servant, and he shall serve you to the 7th year and go out. And then and it keeps on going there. If he come and say, the word that's in contention is in verse 2, starting in verse 2. If you buy kana, a Hebrew servant, this is avri. This is not a Yisraelite or an Eberite. This is that's those two classifications, a Yisraelite or an Eberite. Those are the classifications for an Israelite. That's part of their covenant. That's already inside of being part of Israel. But it's not here in verse 2. It's actually avri. And like I said in the citation, from John Edward J. Woods, this is referring to a foreigner of the nations, or the Goyim, in Leviticus 25:44 through 46.
So it seems then, connecting the dots with your argument, that you're saying that the non-Hebrew servants are set free after 6 years as well. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right, now I want to look again at Numbers 31. So I know that this passage isn't specifically about slavery, but I know I think it's in Deuteronomy 21 that was mentioned earlier. I know that some argue that there's a correlation. So starting in verse 10 of taking a wife in warfare, I mean, would you say that there seems to be a connection there between those two? Or at least that there's a somewhat correlation?
Repeat that, I'm sorry.
Excuse me. In Deuteronomy 21, starting at verse 10 through 14, it talks about female captives.
Oh, yes. I've gone through this in detail so many times. Yeah, I can go through each part if you want me to. If you want me to address each verse, I'll be glad to do that for you.
I was just wondering if you thought that it had correlation with the context of Numbers 31. where they pick the.
Yeah, but also Deuteronomy 20 as well. Yeah, I'm glad to say there's nothing foul or unjust about Deuteronomy 21. I can go to explain that in depth if you want me to. Yeah, I think they would reflect Numbers 31. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so in Numbers 31, it sounded like earlier you were saying that the people that weren't affected by the plague were the ones that were kept alive, and I think you had said
Right.
the women, and then because I mean the context seems to be that everybody except for the women that are virgins are killed, but
Right.
it sounded like you were arguing that also the boys who were virgins were kept alive, or
Right. There was the infants, the very young ones were kept alive. But if you read Numbers 25:9, it shows 24,000 Israelites died because of these plagues, by these Midianite women. So you can see the problem there that it draws, that God had to cleanse. It's what they call divine cleansing, or I forget the exact term what theologians and scholars say. It's called something. Oh, the divine quarantine. So they were quarantining these people off. And they were just flat out evil. They were, sacrificing babies and all sorts of other wicked things. Having bestiality. I mean, this goes all through Leviticus 20. I forget Leviticus something. They go through all the atrocities they were committing.
okay. Something else I was gonna say. Well, go ahead and walk me through the context of Deuteronomy 20 and 21, or whichever one, just so we can get that fleshed out some.
Yes, sure. So, I mean, did I help clear up like Leviticus 25 for you in Exodus 21? Is it more clear than it was before, or do you still have things that are unclear on that?
I understand your argument. I'm not an expert on this. I don't know the Hebrew and all the historical context. So I can't say we were wrong on it. I don't know. So I'm more just fleshing out how you interpret it. I think it's plausible, but I'm sure there are others who know it better that object. So I mean, I'm more just fleshing out what your ideas are. I imagine that it's controversial to conflate Leviticus 25 and the beginning of Exodus 21, because to me that's a major sticking, or at least that seems to be where a major sticking point is that the Hebrew slaves were slaves for 6 years, but then the non-Hebrew slaves were slaves indefinitely of some sort. But I see that you're bridging the two, which is an interesting point. I don't know how that sizes up. I haven't read anything about it, but it's worth looking into.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. And I think in the beginning, or I think it was the beginning, or no, it was the rebuttal. I brought up that they could buy these, if people were, in debt from these nations, that Israel could rescue them out of their debts too. So I'd recommend check that out too, because hopefully I cited everything correctly. But I'm going to start now.
Right, but where is the rescuing of the debts? I think I recall that. I mean, do you know what passage that is, so we can?
Yeah, there's a bunch of them with the Suzerain Treaty. I can go through that. I'll go back and get those for you. Hold on real quick. Yeah, so these verses you can check into would be 2 Samuel 20:24, 1 Kings 4:6, 5:13 through 14, 9:15, 21:12 through 18, 2 Chronicles 10:18. You can see how they worked together to relieve whatever problems there was between each other. That included debt. So if let's say the nations had a problem with debt and they couldn't get out of their debt, then they could go to Israel. If part of the vassal treaty there, they could go to Israel and get debt relief. I think those are pretty clear passages, but I gave also citations for that too. And if you need those, I can provide those as well.
All right, sure. Why don't you go ahead and go through Deuteronomy 21?
All right. Yeah, there's unfortunately a lack of understanding here, but I understand that because it takes so much work and knowledge in the manuscripts in Hebrew and stuff. So that is required, and like a lot of people just don't like to do that. But in Deuteronomy 21:11, there is no rape here because the word desire, hashach, means to be in love. Isaiah 38:7, Deuteronomy 7:7, and Psalms 94:14. Moreover, this word take in the LXX is the Greek word lambano, and it's in the subjunctive mood denoting consent because the podosis and protasis classifies subjunctives as a third-class conditional sentence, making this union conditional. Since it's a conditional and in the mood of hope, it is an agreement or simply a betrothal. Now we're going to go on to Deuteronomy 21:12 through 13. Even if I grant you that the text says mourn, it's merely a formality. The true exegesis is bewail because there's several verbs in the Hebrew that signify mourning rather than baka as used in this passage. One of them is saphad, Genesis 23:2, avel, Genesis 27:41, and avail, Genesis 37:34. What she's really doing is showing bitterness and disgust for her culture. And this is also demonstrated in other verses, Isaiah 33:7, 1 Samuel 1:10, and Proverbs 14:10, because her culture robbed her from having any autonomy. Therefore, like I said, a month's time is a mere formality for a female captive to assimilate. And this is the whole point of this, is that in Numbers 31, these females would be assimilated into the Jewish culture and be proselytized. And the Jewish Targum actually says verbatim, she's proselytizing. Furthermore, several Christian theologians, as Trapp, Pohl, Clark, including influential rabbis, explain this purification process of female captive by renouncing her heathenist, idolatrous culture. Quote, our rabbis taught and bewail her father and mother. Deuteronomy 21:13. Our Eliezer said her father means her actual father. Her mother means her actual mother. And our Akiva said her father and her mother refer to idolatry. So for the scripture says, who says to the wood, thou art my father, end quote. Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Yevamot 48b, and then Aver. I'm going to just go through all the citations. Here's an important part of this quote. Quote, and she shall discard her captive's garb, since she worshipped in these clothes idols, and in the verses which Jacob tells his family, get rid of your idolatrous artifacts that you may purify yourselves and change your clothes. Genesis 35:2. And whatever she can rid herself of from was upon her in her period when she was a Gentile, like her hair, her nails, she must do away with. And this is Rabbi Yosef ben Yashak. I can go through verse 14. The Hebrew verb anah is nuanced. Therefore, I challenge the exegesis of sexual slavery in these passages because, one, the Targum Jonathan employs the word intercourse, not rape or forced sex. If the female captive was violated, therefore, they should become damaged goods, and the text would have included the Hebrew verb tameh. That means rape, as used in Genesis 34:27 in regards to Dinah being raped by Shechem. And third, Deuteronomy 8:2, 3, and 6t employ the same verb, the Hebrew verb anah, in the PL verbal stem, which clearly is in reference to God humiliating Israel and therefore humbling them. God clearly didn't impose himself on Israel or rape Israel. How could he anyway? Because he's an immaterial being, John 4:24. The Greek equivalent employs the same word, tapanao, in regards to being abased. Jesus says, if you exalt yourself, you shall be abased. And this is the same word in the Septuagint used in these texts, Matthew 23:12, Luke 14:11, Luke 18:14, and 3. So hopefully that, gives a good outline what's going on there.
And sorry, what was that last verse where you were talking about that word abased? Like where is that in Deuteronomy?
Yeah, so the Greek equivalent of the word that she was humbled in Deuteronomy 21 is tapainao. And it's the same word, the Greek word used in with Jesus when he says, if you exalt yourself, you shall be abased. the word abased would be the word. And this is Matthew 23:12, Luke 14:11, Luke 18:14, and 3.
Yeah, but sorry, what verse though in Deuteronomy are we referring to
This is
specifically?
referring to Deuteronomy 21:14.
Oh, okay. And sorry, can you just summarize real quick? So it looks like it's this one where you must not treat her as a slave since you have dishonored her. Is that the one? I mean, that's the translation I'm reading. Is that what we're talking about?
I think the word, they in most English texts, it's humbled. But like I said, that goes really in depth. The word humbled there actually means abased. God himself, when he humbled Israel or humiliated Israel. So she's humiliated from her culture because it practices these atrocities. And she's actually happy as hell to get out of there. And I think that's pretty clear because it says she bewailed her culture. Bewailing means that you're bitter over something. It doesn't mean like you're sad. And that's the point I was making, that the word sad actually, if she was going to be sad over something, she would have used these other words, safad, sephod. And and those are the true, applications of mourning. So she's not mourning anything, she's bewailing it.
Okay, so your interpretation here is you must not treat, or at least this is the translation I'm working with, you must not treat her as a slave since you have, and you're saying, or your interpretation is like they sort of set her free. Is that like kind of what you're arguing, that the Israelite soldier has set her free from her culture? Is that the argument?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And she would be bewailing her culture, and like, since God, I guess that would be a humiliation because it's really I think people might even have, I forget what they call it, the battered woman syndrome or something, where they actually feel guilty about something. I think they could even be talking about that. Who knows? But definitely these texts, I think I pretty made it clear that there's no anything forced going on here, anything involuntary or anything that involves rape.
And sorry, you may have mentioned this, but in verse 10, and the translation I have is, when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God hands them over to you, okay, and you take them as captives, suppose you see among the captives a beautiful woman. So are these people that you imagine they've captured, or maybe they have, but the woman still consents? Is that the argument?
Right. So the woman had basically an ultimatum. She could be let go. In fact, that's what it says in the Hebrew, that she can be let go, or if you like her, and then she can, remember that because I mentioned the apologist or the subjunctive, if she agrees and consents to that, then you may take her as a wife. So I think it's the ultimatum. Like, if she didn't want to be part of Israel and proselytize, then she'd be left for dead, because what else does she have to cling on to? She's in the middle of the desert, and like it poses a bunch of problems. And or she could be assimilated into the culture, and I think I demonstrated that through all the citations I showed. She would have to throw away her heathenish customs that she was grown up with. So that was the ultimatum: either change or be left for dead. So
all right, I'm going to give you guys about 3 to 5 more minutes to kind of wrap it up, and then we're going to go to questions. If anybody has a question in the comments, just at me and I'll ask your question.
All right. Yeah, I don't really have any other points. I mean, I think you make interesting points. I'm not at all an expert on this. I'd be curious to hear how others who are more educated on the subject would respond. To me, I mean, obviously when we read it in English, these passages come across as problematic. But,
they do.
Perhaps, I mean, if we have a more in-depth study of the Hebrew and context, I guess to me a lingering concern is like I know there's debate about the authorship and of these books and such, but the fact that like sometimes the arguments are drawn from one book and then saying, well, it applies to another book, I can imagine somebody making the argument that that wouldn't be legitimate to do in a historical context. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think there's good internal evidence that the Pentateuch was authored by Moses. The JEPD hypothesis, I think, has been blown out of the water. I don't think it has any credence. Yeah, I think there's even passages in the Pentateuch itself that Moses says I'm actually writing this down, or actually God says Moses write this down. Several passages. So I think the authorship is preserved internally, but as far as maybe other type of methods, maybe not so much. But I think that's up for debate as well.
What do you mean? What was that last point? You said other methods. What do you mean by that?
As far as like outside accounts affirming that Moses was the author, maybe as far as the church fathers, maybe I'm not sure. I haven't really seen too much evidence from our church fathers. Maybe there is. I don't know. I think Jesus is a good external, someone that says that Moses was the author there.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I would push back on that last argument because I wouldn't want to commit myself to saying that Jesus was wrong if there is strong evidence that, I mean, from what I can tell, I mean, I'm skeptical that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch, but it's not, I guess, not something I'm an expert on. But okay, but that's an interesting point. That's really my last question. I don't really have a lot else. I guess my final perspective, just to summarize, is that whatever interpretation one takes of these passages, I think there are different ways to understand how God could have inspired the Bible. So the hypothesis I've given that it's sort of progressively revealed, I don't claim that that's definitive. Praise could very well be correct on this. And it could be that these problematic passages aren't problematic after all. But my argument is, if they do turn out to be problematic, I don't see that as debunking the idea that God inspired the Bible. And that's more where I'm coming from. But again, I'm not an expert, so I'll just have to defer for Praise to debate somebody who is. But I appreciate you sharing those points. And a lot of those were good points. And I wasn't aware of a lot of those points. So.
Yeah, hopefully at least tonight there is some knowledge brought to people that they can look into, and maybe if they're struggling with some texts in the as far as slavery, sexual slavery, and maybe other things, maybe that could help relieve that. Some of the points I brought up. Yeah, I think it does take a lot of research. I mean, there's a lot of citations, a lot of scholarship out there that's available to people. If you need help, let me know, because I can push you in the right direction with that, and maybe share some stuff that I have. If anyone wants that, just let me know in my email, praisejesuschrist@gmail.com, or just message me on YouTube. I have 2 channels right now because for some reason YouTube didn't hit the enable button on my other account, so I have to use Praise YHVH preliminary, at least for a month or two. So yeah.
Awesome. Appreciate you guys both for that. Interesting dialogue. So I guess what we'll do is we'll take some questions now. Everybody who's in here right now, if you would like the video or subscribe on your way out, and please sub to Dry Apologist and Praise. So our first question is from Jesus is Lord, and he says, at Converse Contender, question for Dry Apologists. Other than in the context of war, POW, can you cite a case in Scripture where involuntary servitude is condoned?
I can't, but in Leviticus 25, I mean, it's kind of vague. I mean, it could be I think that Jesus is Lord. I think you raised this point in the modern day debate discussion I was just listening to. I mean, it could be that Leviticus 25 is about prisoners of war. I don't know that that's what it's about. So, I mean, that's a possibility. But even, I mean, taking prisoners of war can be morally problematic depending upon how it's done. But yeah, maybe Praise has more to say on that.
Yeah, I think the covenant, it's voluntary based. I think it has the signature of that all over the place with like I said, the vassal and suzerain treaties. It's all over the place that everything is voluntary and consented, and I think that's made clear. And if people disagree, I mean, check out my opening. I go through citation after citation after citation.
Oh, real quick, Praise. That was one other question I had. What passage was this treaty between the nations, or is there a verse that you can point to on that between Israel and?
Yeah, I think the big one. I'm going to give you the real big one. Second Samuel 21:2-9 is probably the biggest one because it actually shows the treaty that Israel had between the nations. It was violated by the Israelites, and God held them accountable, and He punished them. So I think that's probably the clearest example of the suzerain treaty. And maybe my citation in the beginning would be also Genesis 1:26-28. Adam would be the first covenantal example of the vassal and suzerain covenant.
All right, great. So for praise, Skylar Fiction says, this is insane. They're not talking about a hypothetical rod.
Right. But no, it's a hypothetical object. And that was my point, because Numbers 35 uses other hypothetical objects. And I'll give Skylar another lesson, just like I will this Friday. Hold on one second. I want Skylar to read this because it goes through in and out his ears sometimes. So maybe he can make sure he gets this, clear in his mind. So you would have, gosh, I hate when I have to fumble through my citation. So I apologize for the delay right now. I'm going to get it real quick for him.
Yeah, no problem. If you want, I could ask Caleb a question, then come back to you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So Caleb, Jesus is Lord says, at Converse Contender, question for dry apologist. For what reason would a slave be beaten?
I mean, I don't know, but it could be for all kinds of reasons, but it seems problematic that a slave master would have the right to beat the slave. So, I think that's where that objection's coming to in that verse. So it doesn't really tell us, but if the implication is that they can beat the slave, then that's what's morally, or seems to be morally problematic, if that's what's being implied.
Okay, thank you for that.
I got it.
Go ahead.
So this is for Skylar. All you got to do is, so Numbers 35 highlights several hypothetical objects for harm, such as the instrument of iron, verse 16, a stone, verse 17, a hand, in verse 18. So a rod used in Exodus 21:20 is just as a hypothetical object as the others in this chapter. So I'd like for him to demonstrate what makes a rod more not of a hypothetical object than the ones mentioned in Numbers 35. Special pleading. There's nothing there that indicates this was, for common practice. I think that debunks that claim where, oh, look, there's a rod there that's representative of slave river history. Well, actually, it's not any more than the objects in Numbers 35.
And is the argument that you're making, Praise, is that the rod is used as a possible, it's like saying, if they're driving a Chevy, doesn't mean that that's the only car that could be driven. It's more just like an example that's being used. Is that the argument? Okay, so and I guess Skylar's objection probably is that the rod seems to have this implication of punishment, and it seems that Praise's response is that it's if the slave master is attacking the slave or servant, and it happens to mention rod. I don't know how the argument holds up, but I think that's.
I think you could use that in a self-defense text. In the very preceding verses in 18 through 19, if the master is quarreling with their servant, then they would have to. If there was something going on there, they would be charged there. It could be any type of innumerable amount of things that could be going on there. How do we know the master wasn't provoked here? And it doesn't say if the master was unprovoked or provoked. So you cannot go out of your way to say that this is indicative of some type of slavery mentality. That's obviously special pleading to the max.
Okay, and we have Noka Suchi says that Tony Designed is the best shill of all times as a comment. We have Skylar Fiction again says he's referring to the passage that you were talking about last with the girl, and it says except that it says she's mourning in the passage.
Yeah, I mean, I thoroughly debunked that. I even gave 3 other Hebrew terms for mourning. It's a veil, and there's saphad. Those are mourning. Bewail means to be bitter over something. Never has bewail ever meant anything of like crying and weeping and mourning. There's nothing there that's in the word bewail that demonstrates that.
All right. Jesus is Lord asked, did he say Leviticus 20?
Is he referring to me or?
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking about Leviticus 25, the passage that keeps getting brought up in these discussions where, you have verse 44, to 46. I mean, it talks about taking slaves or servants from the nations. So it doesn't really indicate whether they're POWs or not. I mean, you can argue they are, and I'm not arguing that's wrong, but that would be a passage I can imagine. I mean, I know that's like what Dr. Josh had cited, and, it's unclear, but somebody can argue that.
All right. I don't see any more questions. If I missed your question, just at me, and so I'll be able to see it and just resend it. If you guys want to take a minute or two to just kind of give your closing thoughts, maybe draw together some of the threads of this conversation, and if there isn't any more questions, then we'll end it.
All right. Well, I just want to make clear in case somebody's confused, because sometimes people are confused about some of the positions I argue. So I'm a Christian. I do believe that God inspired the Bible. I'm more just offering an alternative that, when we find problematic passages, it doesn't necessarily mean that it fully reveals God, that we can look at those and consider that maybe maybe the inspiration works in a different way. I view it, perhaps the Bible is part of a process of inspiration that over time it reveals God gradually, and that's called progressive revelation. And I'm not arguing that's definitively the case, but it's a hypothesis that can help if somebody's struggling with these problematic passages. And it could be that they're not problematic, and if we study the Hebrew and context more, we can absolve those difficulties, but I'm more just throwing out a hypothesis. But again, I'm not an expert, so I'm just interested to hear what people like Praise have to say on this. So that's my summary.
All right, Praise, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just think it takes a lot of research. There's a lot of background information that I think Christians are not, that they're not available to them maybe, or they don't know how to get to the information. I think there needs to be more people that needs to spread the information out there that I've shared tonight, especially the suzerain vassal treaties and the covenant going on. It's all of it is voluntary. Everything's based upon agreements, and everyone was serving someone else. I mean, we even had kings serving other people and stuff. So there's no involuntary. There's nothing that's being forced or inflicted. There's nothing that's being inflicted either. It's like the taskmasters of Egypt doing it to Israelites, and I think God made that distinction anyway. That's real slavery. And what was going on with most of the nations around, Israel and Israel itself, the suzerain, it was based upon debt slavery to keep people out of poverty and for people to stay afloat and even have good lives with their masters. I mean, just imagine if you were in a vet that time that didn't have much, economics to make for you to prosper. Let's say that you had problems economically. What if you were an event of Abraham? You would have been taken care of well. I mean, that would be a top-notch scenario, and that's why they had their ear pierced, and that's why they got tattooed, whatever you want to call it, to stay with their master for their life, because they knew that was advantageous back then, an advantageous lifestyle. That would be the top thing to go after. So if anyone has any questions, let me know. I can hopefully if anyone was missing in knowledge, or if they're trying to figure stuff out, just go back on my opening and read my citations. I think I pretty much covered everything. But I appreciate Converse and also Dry Apologist for coming in here tonight, Caleb, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So, again, tomorrow evening, Praise and I will be moderating on Modern Day Debate. I believe it's going to be at 9 p.m. Check that out if you guys have time tomorrow evening. And then I know at the end of the week, this week, Praise will be debating Skylar Fiction, I believe, on Friday. And then Skylar and I will be having a discussion on next Wednesday. And also, if you guys want to have a discussion with Dry Apologist, you can hit him up on Twitter. He's open to any discussions you guys may have. And is there any other links or anything you guys want to share?
I mean, my YouTube channel, you can look at that, but yeah, also Twitter.
Yeah, definitely follow Dry Apologist. He's putting out things every day on the ontological argument, on the contingency argument, on the problem of evil. I'm seeing him post things a lot, sometimes a couple of videos a day. So check it out and let him know what you think about his arguments. And yeah, I really appreciate you guys coming out and checking out the stream, and really appreciate the contenders, Praise and Caleb. He's on Twitter at Caleb Cumberland, not Dry Apologist, just so you guys know. And thanks again for everyone.